Hi, welcome back to the TT Wine Explorer podcast. I'm Tanya Tomaszewska. Today's episode is about wine and trade relations. It's about how trade tariffs threatened to be levied by the United States on Canadian goods may affect the wine and alcohol beverage industry and consumers on both sides of the border. It's also about the layered knock-on effects which may flow from a trade tariff war between the United States and Canada. There is so much going on here on so many levels. When I was sorting through all of my thoughts on this last week and considering how I might bring this conversation to you, my friend and industry colleague Karen Graham immediately came to mind. Karen is a public policy expert and has deep experience in wine, policy, and regulatory issues affecting the British Columbia and Canadian wine industry. Among many roles, Karen is on the board of the Canadian chapter of the International Wine Law Association and the International Vancouver Wine Festival. Karen also has been a senior policy analyst for the Business Council of BC, an economic and political advisor for the U.S. Consulate General in Vancouver, and she's been a director of advocacy and stakeholder relations for the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. And so, as you might imagine, Karen's dual-track public policy and wine industry expertise is a perfect pairing for today's discussion. Now, Karen and I discuss a lot today, including how tariffs levied by the U.S. may affect Canadian producers and industry, how Canadian countervailing response measures may affect U.S. producers and wine industry, the different approaches taken by Ontario and British Columbia in response to threatened tariffs, and whether this trade war could finally help to bring down our own trade barriers and walls, which we have here in Canada. We also discuss possible tariffs levied by the U.S. against the EU and the role of the WTO, if any, in this landscape. Karen and I first met through mutual friends when I became involved in the wine industry. We often get together as part of wine industry roundtable discussions or over a glass of wine or cup of tea in Vancouver or the Okanagan Valley to have chats like these. Now, several times during this conversation, you'll hear that Karen and I have a good laugh. This is not because we underestimate the importance or severity of the matters which we're discussing, but rather, and in my view, this exemplifies how free-flowing conversations and the sharing of ideas can unfold. And one last comment before we dive into this conversation. Events are unfolding so rapidly in this space, and so the facts on the ground, which we discuss today, may be different by the time you hear or listen to this episode. While U.S. tariffs aimed at Canada may become more targeted and less blanket-oriented, we could still find that Canadian retaliation includes targeting U.S. alcohol. Regardless, I think that a number of themes which Karen and I discussed today will apply or are relevant in the context of understanding and navigating trade barriers and tariff regimes from altitude. I always love my conversations with Karen Graham, and I hope you will too. Let's fly. Hi, Karen. Welcome to the TT Wine Explorer podcast. Thanks so much for joining as my guest today.
Hi, Tanya. Thank you very much for having me.
So before we dive into our tariff talk, I thought we'd start a little bit about you. Through your consultancy called Wine Drops, you provide, among other things, advisory services and commentary on policy and business matters relating to the Canadian wine industry. You also have a really deep knowledge on all things BC wine industry, and you have expertise in international trade relations and underlying policies and regulations. Now, I think you're a policy wonk in all of the best sides of the senses of the word. So, for those who don't know you, could you share just a little bit about your story, your background, in terms of how you developed your expertise, and a bit about your path as to how you got here?
Sure. Well, I've really had, over the past 20 to 25 years, I would say parallel careers in wine and public policy. And over the past 5 to 10 years, I've really tried to knit those two together. So I've been Vancouver-based for much of that time, working with think tanks and the private sector, very much engaging with government, mostly at the British Columbia provincial level. And simultaneously, carrying on with my experience in wine. I've done 2 stints in the Okanagan, British Columbia's Okanagan Valley. And every time I spent time there and or lived there, I just got closer and closer to the industry. So I'll maybe plant a little theme here because I think it will come up in the rest of our conversation. And that is, there really is a conviviality and camaraderie to the wine industry. And that doesn't respect borders or boundaries. So that's really one of the things that's just kept me always passionate and involved and supportive of the wine industry generally, BC and Canadian especially.
I think that there are so many great things there about the conviviality and the borderless nature of the wine industry. And I think this borderless nature ties in, as you say, very well into about our talk here about trade and tariffs and what's going on. And I also appreciate the fact that you have such great experience both in the wine industry and public policy, because this conversation today, although it could go in very many directions in terms of tariffs on various products or tariffs that are threatened to be levied in relation to various products, we're going to focus today on the alcohol industry, alcohol beverage industry, and wine. But of course, a large part of trade is not just wine. Spirits is a big one, and beer. So with that, why don't we kick off? Okay, so there's a lot going on in terms of tariff measures that have been threatened by President Trump of the United States against Canada and Mexico, and retaliatory measures taken in response by Canada at both the federal and provincial levels. Now, right now, we're in a hiatus of sorts, but I think that everyone is bracing for what might come on March 1st. But in the meantime, there appears to be gathering political will in Canada amongst leaders and business and consumers to get ahead of this and try and mitigate potential fallout. So, with that in mind, I know we're kind of in this limbo zone, but let's talk about what we think could happen in terms of what leaders have articulated so far and how they might respond. So, why don't we start with tariff measures taken by the US against Canada? So, in broad terms, how do we think this unilateral measure could affect the Canadian wine and spirit industry? I mean, we don't export a lot of wine in comparative terms from British Columbia or Canada into the US, but we make a lot of spirits and beer. So, I know this is a huge question, so maybe just a few responses if you like, or thoughts, but what are the potential consequential knock-on effects of the US levying a 25% tariff on our Canadian alcohol beverage goods?
Right. So there could be a lot, and these could be quite far-reaching in consequence. They could also be quite nuanced. It will depend a little bit on. I mean, it looks like the tariffs that are probably going to come. We should assume that they will be a fairly broad brush with not a lot of carve-outs, not a lot of minute details. So I think we should expect and assume that the top line headline will be what everyone has to grapple with. I can give examples in a sec, but to frame out maybe what is our baseline, and then to compare what we have to work against. So just for the audience's interest and knowledge, I just pulled a few background stats on sort of what is the nature of Canada-US trade in wine. I'm more versed in wine than anything else, so obviously beer and spirits are very significant sectors, and they could feel the effects from US tariffs probably more consequentially than wine. So the US wine category is second only to Canadian wine through, and I'll just use British Columbia's statistics for a moment. So through the BC Liquor Distribution Branch's wholesale division. So you can see reports that they publish quarterly. So based on December 2024, the US wine imports to British Columbia accounted for 13% of overall sales. This is all in wholesale dollars, not retail prices. Declined that they dropped by about 2% year over year from December 2023. So 13% of the BC wholesale market. British Columbia wine, by contrast, is the largest single category, and that accounts for 42%. So just under half. It has been a little bit higher, 47% in the previous year. So British Columbians already drink a lot of British Columbia wine, as we know, and I'm sure as we've discussed in many other forums. So the LCBO in Ontario, just a quick stat from the Ontario picture, $1 billion of American beverage alcohol, so that's all categories, are sold in LCBO outlets. So there's certainly integrated trade there, a lot of imports. That is going to be significant from the countervailing aspect, which we'll get to in a sec. So Canada, as of 2022, I didn't have anything from 2023, but exports about $68 billion worth of wine. Most of it bulk. We don't make a lot of bottled wine to send south of the border. We have some good friends in the BC wine industry who are selling small quantities to the US. And in wholesale prices, again, Canada imported about $484 million worth of US wine. So that is in itself, we're talking about trade imbalance as the origin for, or the impetus for US tariffs. The US does send about $500 million at wholesale prices of wine to Canada every year. So significant for them. So getting to the potential knock-on effects of the US levying 25% tariffs, it does depend on how each province tends to handle this by way of response. So my first take on US tariffs on Canadian wine, not too significant, I think. So for two reasons. One, there may be, and I don't know the internal economics of every winery or every vineyard producer across the country. The first question that they would be asking themselves is, okay, do I have any latitude to adjust my sale price so that the finished good or whomever it's sold to in the United States is not priced so high then by comparison that I'm going to lose my export business. So is there price flexibility there? And
Yeah,
if not,
and sort of jump in. That's a great point because already there is discussion about whether Canadian, the wholesale price of Canadian wines exported in the world is comparatively high. So that's already something that I think a lot of producers are grappling with and navigating, not all, but many. So
right.
This is another look at, another turn of the screw in margins, right?
Yep, correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think because we're not talking about a massively integrated market purely from Canadian side reacting to US tariffs, that's why I say it's not good. None of this is good, right? No one wins. But there's the possibility that because Canadians drink so much Canadian wine and most of it, finished wine, is sold here, my sense is that it will not be the hardest hit sector.
Right. And so, interestingly, maybe we'll get to that next, is maybe not directly, but then the indirect consequences of the tariffs being levied, which are, for example, the countermeasures being taken,
right,
or increased costs of input to make your product as a result of the economic consequences more broadly of tariffs being levied against Canadian goods and the effects on our economy. I know these are huge issues, but it's like, it's like we're kind of pulling through the threads of these knock-on effects, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. So I was trying to frame a narrow answer to the specific.
Yeah. No,
question,
I appreciate that.
But exactly when you broaden it out, and certainly, just looking from BC Winery's perspective, as we know, and each of us in various ways have discussed over the last 2 years, certainly, this really couldn't come at a worse time for British Columbia wineries who are already facing deep challenges when it comes to input prices have stabilized a little bit, but we've all faced inflation on intermediate goods and finished goods for some time. The inflation rate may be coming down, but the price of most of our inputs is staying at a new elevated level. That is our new normal. So combine that with short crop and then last year's deep freeze. I know we will probably end up talking a little bit about how BC wineries have been rescued in terms of grape supply and juice. We can come to that if you like. But it is not helpful at all, especially in the layering on of Canadian countervailing, either tariffs or what we're talking about, what most provincial governments that I've been hearing of talking about is essentially managing the stock, a quota,
Yeah.
which is a quota of 0 according to
Yeah.
some provinces. So
Right. And so on that, maybe we'll jump to potential retaliation if President Trump brings in tariffs on March 1st. And I appreciate that we're jumping around and skating across the ice, so to speak, of a lot of layered issues, but perhaps we can frame this conversation as a 101, so to speak, of all of these parallel threads that need to be considered. And then maybe we can deep dive into some with some practical examples, for lack of better words. So why don't we jump to the potential retaliation to any tariffs that may be levied on March 1st against Canadian goods, and within that, alcoholic beverages. So you mentioned the LCBO and the LDB here in British Columbia. So far, we've seen some steps which Ontario, BC, and Nova Scotia on a provincial level might or would likely take. So again, maybe we've covered this, but with Ontario, through the LCBO, which you've mentioned, $1 billion a year. I mean, they're the biggest purchaser of alcohol in the world, I understand. And Premier Doug Ford, indicated that if the tariffs are levied by President Trump, he will direct his monopoly arm to pull all American alcoholic goods off the shelves. And this would also prevent the distribution of those goods to, I believe, restaurants and licensees in Ontario. I think bourbon is be a huge part of that factor.
right, sure,
And I
sure, yeah,
think that Canada is the biggest market for bourbon, American, bourbon outside of America. This could be
okay.
huge.
Doesn't surprise me, right?
So I think you've probably talked about the numbers. So it seems to me that, what does that mean, do you think, from a policy perspective, if we can look at it this way? Because there's policy and then there's the practicalities, and where do they meet in the middle? So certainly that would have a massive impact on the U.S. Alcohol industry, and they've indicated that. The Wine Institute in America has indicated to the leadership in America what this would mean for their industry. Um,
Sure. Yeah.
could
Yeah.
something like this backfire on Canadian consumers? Like, what would that mean? Or does that mean more space on the shelves for Canadian products or other products? What does that mean for consumer? Does that mean prices of any other goods go up? Like, what do you think?
Right. Right.
Looking into the crystal ball.
Well, I think along the supply chain, I mean, this is no one wins, right? I'm reiterating a
Yeah.
comment I already made, but no one asked for this in the beverage industry on either side of the border. And yet here we are about to be. So you're right. California Wine Institute, they put out a statement last week saying Canada is the single most important export market for U.S. wines, with retail sales in excess of U.S. dollars, 1.1 billion annually. This is from the CEO of the Wine Institute, which is based in California. Any loss of access to the Canadian market will damage the entire U.S. wine sector. So this is potentially catastrophic for them. So let's say, Canadian tariffs of 25% countervailing against the U.S. tariff, on top of, this will take effect in different ways based on what we understand different provinces to do. So this is obviously a federal tariff. Only the federal government has the power to levy tariffs and taxes on alcoholic goods in this context. So let's say we'll take up the LCBO first of all. So I think the harder line taken by the Ontario government is partly sort of policy interpretation mixed with politics here. So the Progressive Conservative government of Ontario, Premier Doug Ford, has an election to win. So there is I think we can't ignore that there's an election political overlay to this. That might be their outlook anyways, as more sort of stern steps to take to push back. So if we're talking about pulling American liquor of all kinds from the shelves and stopping purchasing it, this was a very significant and blunt instrument to use to retaliate. So if they're not buying any liquor from the US, then a federal 25% tariff isn't, is meaningful, but isn't probably going to be enacted in practice. So I'll come back to Ontario in a second as far as how that could feel for a consumer. But I want to jump over to BC as well, because what we understand from Premier Eby in British Columbia, as far as how the BC government will direct the BC Liquor Distribution Branch to conduct itself, is to pull, I think it works out to be the top 5 spirit-based goods from Republican-led states. So red states versus blue states, Democratic-led states. So I can come to the reason for that distinction, or what we think might be behind that distinction, in a moment. But I did do some calculations based on British Columbia's markup here. So this might help audience members when they're thinking about, if I'm still going to go buy California wine, I'm a California wine fan, but my patriotism is jumping to the fore, and I'm only going to drink British Columbia Chardonnay or British Columbia Pinot Noir, Canadian wine, or wines from other places, to the exclusion of U.S. wine. So a 25% tariff levied on wines, even if they are from so-called blue states, to be purchased in British Columbia. So I did a side-by-side comparison. At the high end, a $60, and I'm using just Canadian dollars here so that we're not playing around with the exchange rate. So a wine priced at $60 in bond price. So we're talking really quite high end. This is not the retail price. This is the in bond price, to which all of the British Columbia markups are added. So right now, a $60 wine that is applied to at the liquor board, they pick it up, they say, okay, we're going to run it through our formula. That works out to be $89.38 wholesale price. So then they would mark it up and put it out at retail or sell it to restaurants. The BC equivalent, so a BC priced wine that they want to sell to the liquor board at $60, the various rest of the markups and recycling fee and all the other aspects that are actually the same, other than one piece here, is $86. So $89 versus $86 roughly. So not too bad. When a 25% tariff is levied, it goes on to that wine right at the beginning stage of the process of adding markups, adding GST, etc. So now the US wine at $89 is suddenly $110, and the BC wine stays at $86.59. So these are very elevated prices. I wanted to use that example to capture the escalator on the markup structure that the British Columbia Liquor Distribution Branch applies. Back down into the real world, I did a calculation on, say, it's a $20 in bond cost for the wine. That comes to $33 for, say, a US wine, and a little bit less than that for BC, not too much. It's within the $33 price range. But then if you're applying a tariff, a 25% tariff, it hits basically $41 US, from $20 up to $41. And then the BC equivalent, of course, would stay at 33. So you can see the magnification of the tariff here. So this is going to really, really hurt American wine coming into British Columbia. So even if you still, you're taking a deep breath and you're like, oh, okay, I'm still going to support California vintners because they didn't ask for this, so I'm going to carry on and buy their wine. Holy cow, are you going to feel it? Because you're actually, because of where that tariff gets applied early in the process of the markups, it takes 25% and gets it closer to 35, 40%. So that's how, the Canadian consumer, if they're buying American wine, that's what they're going to face. If they are adjusting their preferences and purchasing wines from elsewhere in the world, everything basically stays the same. The effect on retail shelves is probably going to be less in British Columbia than it would be in Ontario. Some of our common colleagues have been pointing out, well, what does that do to shelf space and access and so on? I don't particularly see that as being relevant in British Columbia. If the wines are not being pulled from the shelves, then it doesn't change the shelf configuration. In Ontario, that's I would guess, if the Ford government proceeds as it's committed to, that is a different question. And so perhaps, what does that shelf get filled with? And I think, the part of the answer to that is depends on how consumers respond. If there
Yeah.
is suddenly really a lot of demand pressure for this is crazy. Well, I'm not getting all of the Ontario wines that I would like to
Yeah.
purchase. Let's get some more of those onto those LCBO shelves. So I know it's not
Yeah.
quite that simple, but in times of crisis, you have to
Yeah.
move fast. And I think that's the
Yeah.
moment.
And we'll get to the interprovincial part in a moment, I think. So thank you for the very detailed outline of some practical examples of what that could mean for consumer, at least in the context of British Columbia purchasing, and your observations that patriotism aside, and what steps individual consumers may take in order to respond to tariffs. We're also at a time economically where people will say, "Hey, that's my favorite bottle of Chard from California. I love that Oregon Pinot Noir, and I can get beyond, or I want to support my, brothers and sisters south of the border, but my pocketbook can't right now." So it's
Sure.
this kind of compounding, borderless. We're borderless in our wine industry, Camaraderie, but the borders with the currency right now, already putting aside tariffs, is
Brutal.
staggering. So
Yeah, exactly.
there are
It's very
all
good.
sorts of layers and knock-on effects to discuss here. So before we come back to the interprovincial barriers, and also, can this crisis bring on some movement within our own country about freeing up our borders? I wouldn't mind just going back a little bit to the retaliatory measures and the distinction that you framed regarding the Ontario response to these potential tariffs and the British Columbia response. So as you've noted, Premier Eby said, "Well, we'll pull the 5 largest, liquor brands from red states." And to be, as I understand it, that is a huge amount of dollars worth of it, like huge, like that would hurt the producers in America.
Sure.
I think the spirits industry is really in the crosshairs here in broad terms.
Right.
Uh, but I heard when this announcement was made, there was a lot of different talk and observation about that, which is, listen, if you do it, it's all or nothing. Like you said, no one wins. It's a zero-sum game, but you can't kind of go halfway. You got to go all the way. However, in British Columbia, as many people know, this last vintage here in particular was very, very challenging. You know, the majority of the crop in the interior of British Columbia was wiped out by a cold freeze. As a result, many wineries, not all, but many wineries decided to have a replacement vintage, as we called it, and purchased grapes or must from places like Washington State, Oregon, and California, which happen to be blue states. So, you and I have had discussions about this. I have another podcast with Alison Moyes of Solvero where we talk about this. So, I think for me, this is where policy and practicality and trade war are meeting somewhere, which is, wow, we just had great camaraderie and some symbiosis in what we might call our Cascadia region: British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California. Many of those wine growers had a glut of grapes. We needed grapes, and we worked together. We just kind
Yeah,
of, we put
absolutely.
those boundaries and barriers aside, and we figured it out,
Right.
and everyone was helped. So
Yeah.
now,
And
now we're
so
in
now
this, oh
we're
my
on
gosh, if we pull the wine
right.
from those 3 states, what are we doing here? What's going on? So all this to say, and I'm sure there's no answer, but for you, Karen, from a policy perspective, and I don't know if we can even talk about it this way, but from a policy point of view, in terms of effectiveness of counter tariffs or countervailing measures, in broad terms, is it all or nothing? Is that what typically people would expect? Or, this is a huge question, or are there different types of countervailing measures that people will take? Like, were you surprised by this? And I guess I don't mean necessarily in terms of the political landscape in the wine industry, although I'd be happy for you to comment on that, but from a policy perspective, I guess.
Right, right. Well, I'm of 2 minds, and have a divided heart on this. I would say, so I think it's very bad politics, especially given the America that we are dealing with today and for the coming 4 years, to inject our tariff response into American politics. So why it cannot be good as a matter of the relationship to pick blue states over red states. So in that sense, I would say a blanket response, what is being aimed at Canada, at Mexico, potentially other countries, is by every piece that's been released so far, by comments from the US president, from interpretations of those comments and readouts from meetings that have been held between the Canadian federal government and the US government, indicate that this is broad brush stuff from the Americans' perspective. So we should respond in kind. Tariffs and the setting of tariffs is a federal national matter, not a provincial matter. So I say this I just think it's probably not helpful to have picked blue states over red states in terms of what the provincial British Columbia government has
from a unity approach, responding from nation to nation.
That's right. It just feels to me like that's not helpful, and it may bite us as we continue down these negotiations. And we'll see what gets levied on March 1st. I have zero expectation that it will be anything less than 25% on pretty much everything except the oil carve out that's already been mentioned. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, as you introduced, this really is the reality of what is in the process of saving much of the British Columbia, so especially Okanagan Valley and Similkameen Valley wine industry this past year was some very nimble and helpful liaisons and contractual arrangements between Washington growers, Oregon growers, I think maybe a couple from Idaho, I'm not 100% sure about that, Northern California, and Ontario, for that matter. All of those jurisdictions made arrangements and worked with multiple levels of government as required to sell grape juice or unfinished wine to British Columbia producers who had been completely wiped out from the deep freeze of January 2024. So where does this go? I think, first of all, it's the need is not just over 1 year. The policy that within which British Columbia wineries are operating at the moment is that, so this markup structure I was just discussing, markup relief has been granted to British Columbia wineries using American fruit, Ontario fruit as well, but American fruit, juice, unfinished wine for 1 year for the equivalent of, to replace the 2024 harvest. So what does that mean in this context? What does that mean for future years? So in that context, you would then say, well, it's pretty helpful that probably the blue state exemption is a signal, I think, to acknowledge by the BC government, to acknowledge the role that vineyards and producers in those states, just probably by sheer geography more than politics, but have used to help British Columbia. And by the way, it was mutually beneficial because for various business reasons, especially in Washington state, there has been excess grape supply, which everyone's aware of. So the way I can see that possibly tracking forward is I think the British Columbia government will probably need to have a good listening ear to the needs expressed by the BC wine industry for the coming year, at least one more vintage and probably two, for some level of support. And not just support, I think there's actually some quite positive business arrangements and maybe some innovative wines about to be produced and released under, what is out of necessity. Some quite interesting and innovative things could be happening. So the need by Washington and some Oregon and some California wineries to sell some fruit to British Columbia, as I understand it, were on quite favorable cost terms. Yeah. So if we're still in a world now, we're talking tariffs on finished wine, but it might who knows where the CUSMCA is in terms of maintaining tariff-free movement of unfinished wine. So that's a question. So already
Yeah.
we're well beyond the blanket here. This is the nuances are going to really matter as far as what is included and what is exempt. Canada will have to think about that too in terms of next year, say some
Yeah.
unfinished juice or unfinished wine is coming north of the border to help British Columbia again. They
Yeah.
may have to be in a different world of trimming some prices and making it still work for all parties. So,
Well, yeah.
at the other end of every policy are the practical implications on the sectors affected, and then ultimately, of course, on what the wine lover ends up paying for his or her next bottle of wine.
Absolutely. And so just in that example, there are three layers there. There's the cost to buy and whether or not it'll be subject to a tariff and to what percentage, but also right now with our currency swings, like look at the Canadian dollar at the moment is under 70, right? So
Right. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
one step at a time, but hard to predict where we'll be in a year. But what we do know is, I think, that there will be a certain number of producers in British Columbia who will not have their grapes growing yet
Right.
to produce. And they're going to
Not
need
in
to get,
sufficient quantity,
if
probably.
they would like to keep going and they don't have enough inventory to sell through for a couple of years, they need to find their input agricultural product in order to do that. So on that, maybe we'll jump to within Canada, and you noted about Ontario and uh, that some British Columbia vintners brought in grapes or juice from Ontario. Um, and this is a big deal also about camaraderie in the Canadian landscape.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, just to come back a little bit to this tug of the heart as far as um, all or nothing tariffs or a nuanced approach. And just by way of example, so I have the honor of serving as the vice chair of the board of the Vancouver International Wine Festival, which comes up at the end of this month, so late February. And it's in its 46th year. It has really been a showplace and feature for wines from everywhere. And one of the reasons I love the festival every year is it does remind us all of the camaraderie of wine, and that is borderless, despite all of the pragmatic concerns and aspects we've been discussing and will continue to discuss on your podcast here. This year, the winery selection or the selection committee has selected the Western United States as our theme and feature region. And so, despite these difficult times, we're really looking forward to welcoming, I think it's 50 wineries up and down the US West Coast. These are wineries that are not new to British Columbia. Some of them may be new to British Columbia. Some of them may also be producers that have now formed what we hope will be long-lasting and deep bonds with British Columbia wineries. So, as we are thinking patriotically and drinking more Canadian wine versus U.S. wine, and as we pointed out, what the tariff structure is likely to do to the cost of a bottle of American wine, absolutely respect what that means for individuals and making their choices. But yeah, just a bit of a shout out for the camaraderie and the heartfelt, good faith effort of these folks for coming up in a couple of weeks and bringing the best of what they do and contributing to Vancouver's very, very deep and very knowledgeable wine culture, and playing a role in knitting together the Cascadia region and Western North America in terms of really great wine growing and winemaking regions.
Here, here, Karen. I will be attending the Wine Fest this year and look forward to swirling many of those wines in my glass. And I'm attending some of the trade tastings and seminars, and many of those wines and regions will be highlighted. So thank you so much for mentioning that. I'm really looking forward to it.
Great.
But now let's talk about how some of that might play into hopefully some of the political will that's gathering about our own trade barriers and trade wars we've seen within our own country and this federation. Who knew? So
Great.
why
Yeah.
don't before we dive into international aspects about this tariff and trade war, let's talk about our trade barriers here in Canada, which already exist. So in many ways and in the normal course, it seems much easier for us here to buy wine. Let's say I'll just use me as an example in British Columbia right now, to buy wine from the United States than from other parts of our own country. I mean, I've heard some people say that they'd rather pay a 25% tariff to buy a US wine than pay the essentially, much higher markup to buy wine from another province in our own country. So, it still astounds me. And, just for listeners, you may recall that in episode 10 of this podcast series, I had our wine industry colleague, Mark Hicken, come on to talk about what is the basis of this, what happened to free trade in a federation. So, not to understate the pain ahead from tariffs that are levied on Canadian goods. I think a big silver lining here could be that our federal and provincial governments, supported by business, come together and finally lower our own internal trade barriers and walls. And in fact, Minister Anand this week has stated that the lowering of Canadian international trade walls could happen in 30 days with the political will. So, as you know, many industry stakeholders and businesses here have been calling out for this for years, and no government at any level seems to have been able to affect this on it in a holistic way. So, huge question. Can you provide us with any kind of update on, I know this is a moving thing, a fluid situation, but, what do you think? Is there leadership now in broad terms at any specific levels? Are we seeing this happen, federally, provincially, other stakeholders? Will people let go? A lot of people will say this is about the money and
Sure.
this kind of division of from federal and provincial division of responsibilities and revenue. Are people going to let go of some of that? Like, what do you think?
Right. Yeah.
Or
No,
I
this
know
is
these are the questions we
an
don't know. We're
equally big
looking in the
one.
crystal ball, but it
Right.
seems to me we are much closer to this happening now than we have been
And
in
isn't
a
it
while.
amazing what can happen, what a crisis can bring
Yeah.
on? So,
Yeah.
historically, I would say there has been a dearth of leadership, and it's not a good look on any
Mhm.
Canadian level of politics.
Mhm.
Um, so there hasn't been leadership, not sufficient leadership. Uh, as we record this, the prime minister and provincial leaders, premiers, are meeting in Toronto to discuss these very topics. How can we lift, eliminate, or at least improve, ameliorate interprovincial trade barriers on all sorts of products? Right, we know all about the marketing boards and various things in a number of natural sectors. There are trade standards that don't make sense when you drive from Manitoba to Saskatchewan, or maybe from Manitoba to Ontario. So I would say there hasn't been sufficient leadership. And so just, looking back a little bit, so a few comments. First, we do know how to do this. There are a few subnational models already in place. The New West Partnership among British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba that dropped standards for sure dropped the differentiation of standards on a number of procedures, on education, recognized education standards, a few other things. So we have a baseline understanding of how we can go about harmonizing some of our regulations and certainly some goods and people movements for employment and what have you. It's sadly incomplete, of course, in terms of Canadian-produced wine, beer, spirits, refreshments, etc. Secondly, we also know from the Supreme Court of Canada decision in 2017 on COMO, which is the shorthand, where a New Brunswick citizen was fined for driving 354 bottles of beer across the provincial boundary from Quebec. So the Supreme Court said in its decision on that it considers any change to trade barriers really to be a parliamentary matter. It declined to reinterpret the recently accepted constitutional case law. So it's very clear this must be led from the legislative political leadership. So third, as you referenced, hearing from Minister Anand, who's now at Transportation and Internal Trade and formerly led the Treasury Board, so she has a very good understanding of the fiscal and financial implications, as well as the goods movement implications from her present portfolio. To have these barriers dismantled in a month, to which I ask, why has it been impossible to solve for decades? So we had the Agreement on Internal Trade, which was in place among the Federation up until 2017, which did nothing to ease the movement of beverage alcohol among provinces and territories. Then, presumably as a 150th birthday present to Canada, the provinces and the feds introduced the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. And I just have to pause. I mean, capital letters, Canadian Free Trade Agreement. I mean, what
Yeah.
country needs a
I
free
know.
trade agreement?
I shouldn't be laughing. It's not
No,
funny, but
no.
it seems ridiculous.
And
Yeah.
it is, right?
Yeah.
So it again carved out liquor as an area for further study, i.e., it was just a parking lot for it. So my further thoughts on that is, what country needs its own internal trade agreement where actually nothing changes? So this is one that is unwilling to work hard enough on liberalization until the crisis. And so the crisis is here. And I referenced the Supreme Court of Canada decision in Como. I'm going to take us back historically just for a moment here to comment on this. So this was actually a matter that was fairly central in the arguments brought to the Supreme Court in terms of interpreting how free trade within the Federation was expected and anticipated by the founders to function. So at the constitutional moment, so when our first Canadian Constitution was put into place, the framers included robust free trade clauses in our 1867 Constitution because of the impending repeal by the United States of the Reciprocity Treaty dating from 1866, which had been in place for 12 years. This loomed large over the new country's economic viability. So not only do we know how to do this in terms of the New West Partnership and knitting our provincial standards and goods movement together, we have actually faced this moment at the very founding of our country. So what happens in the US matters to us. I don't know that we have the muscle memory to be thinking in those terms right now. This feels very fresh and very threatening, a 25% across the board tariff by the United States without very much warning. We have been here before. And so there are, what was the response then? Strengthen our own internal trade. So I don't want to belabor this because I know we could probably continue for another whole hour on this. This really, that's right. This matters, right? Historically, this does matter, and it helps frame where we are now.
Well, absolutely, because I think running the numbers so that, for lack of better words, everyday Canadians can understand what this can mean for both their province where they live and collectively, and a unified Canada
That's right.
is what
Actually,
we
one thing
need. Economic unified Canada is what we need. And, obviously there are provincial borders, but the
let's
more
complete
that
the project.
people can put numbers out to what this practically can mean for our economy and the potential knock-on effects of increased productivity. We are low in the OECD rankings of productivity in Canada right now.
Very
Our
concerning.
own internal supply chains need help. We need structure. I mean, that's a whole other episode about silver linings potentially of this, and a lot of people are talking about. But money that could be redeployed to support initiatives to bolster our internal capabilities, right?
Certainly, absolutely. And I actually just wanted to bring it back to specifically to wine in a second. You had mentioned, will provincial authorities, and I'm going to just again focus in on liquor authorities, will they let go of their tax and markup dollars? So what I would say by way of example and reassuring answer to that, because I can imagine some audience members saying, well, all this stuff helps pay for education, healthcare, et cetera, which are still, we're in dire need of more and better of both. So there's a couple of provinces, I think 4 and counting, we hope, who have opened their own borders to interprovincial trade private, in the biz, we call it DTC, direct to consumer purchases of small amounts of Canadian wine for the moment. We'll see what happens as a result of the meetings today and the larger project. But the best arrangement doesn't actually deprived. So we can argue, and maybe they'll have another future discussion about, are the markup levels appropriate by the liquor distribution branch in British Columbia or other
Right.
provinces, depending on their model. But if you accept that those are valid and they serve valid social purposes that allow the public sector to deliver services to British Columbians, to Canadians, they don't have to give that up. So there's mechanisms whereby I'm a consumer in Alberta. I'm going to use the BC Alberta example right now, which has just been concluded after some strife last year, and that is, so an Alberta consumer, a club member of 3 or 4 or 6 different British Columbia wineries, can now phone, have their wine delivered, and yet the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission is still made whole. This is what's been in place in a few different places. The American states know how to do this quite well. The DTC market there hit some rocky times very recently, but as a result of adjusting consumer demand. But it's a fairly helpful trade challenge, especially for smaller and medium-sized producers. And so what they do is they make sure that the export is still makes the provincial liquor authority, in this case, in the receiving province, whole. So no one is losing in terms of, this isn't clandestine in any way. So the sale still is registered somehow, and tax revenue can still be collected in the jurisdiction where it's meant to be collected. So I don't have a lot of time or patience for, the myopia or the mini empires that have been allowed to perpetuate and grow in power, quite frankly, within the Canadian Federation. Because with some innovation, with a crisis that you're facing, and with some smart thinking, there are ways to adjust your policies so that the public who consumes medical care, health services, and so on, doesn't have to be deprived just because some liquor is starting to be sold across provincial boundaries.
Thank you. To use your words, we can do this. And so thank you for bringing it back down into the world of the wine. I know I've been using broad language because I think right now a lot of us out there are looking at this in terms of where we're sitting economically and our goods. But thank you for bringing it back into that example of wine. And I think you're right. The this resolution of this Alberta BC trade war wine, I'll call it that. Maybe that's a bit dramatic now in the context, but that is a good example. And up until then, Mark Kick and I talked about this last year during this discussion, which is we already did that with wines coming in from other places. So we can do this. It can happen. It can be, there can be accounting. Surely all of the people who are, can do formulas and accounting and the systems, we can do this. So hopefully that is a great case study and example that can be rolled out not only within our, the wine and alcohol spirit industry, but more broadly to other Canadian industries that may have, they're dealing with things that are akin to this. Sure. Okay, I think we could spend like an hour on this, and maybe we will one day, but maybe not today. So in the spirit of our 101, if you don't mind, I thought we could jump to a few other places, virtual places. So let's go to Europe. So we know that President Trump is taking aim at Canada and Mexico, America's so-called free trade partners. But the EU could be next. So from altitude or deep dive into any point you wish, could you give an outline of what we think is being threatened tariff-wise by the United States onto EU? I know EU I'm using as a trading bloc, obviously. Right. And how, and what kinds of measures the EU or individual nations, if that can happen, can take, and what kind of impact this could be. Like you said, no one wins here. And I was just reading this morning that American buyers are stockpiling Prosecco, buying from Italy now because they're anticipating and Prosecco's had a huge boom in America. They know what consumers want. Sure. So I know that's a practical step that people are taking, but what is the EU? Let's say we're sitting in the EU. What are we thinking? Like, what are we bracing ourselves for?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I'll break that down and
Yeah,
talk
sorry, I
about.
threw a lot of questions at you at
No,
once, but
that's
take what
fine.
ones you want.
Yeah, yeah. No. We can do it all.
Okay.
On this
Okay, good.
podcast, the TP's podcast, we can do it all. So actually, I think where I'll start is what impact this might have on the U.S. wine industry, alcohol industry generally. But uh, I'll stick to my sphere because I don't know enough about the other sectors. But just on the wine side, so because I think this is actually very interesting, and one of the best people in the business who is writing about this um, is Eric Asimov from the New York Times, the wine writer from the New York Times. So to his vast credit, he so I'm pulling all of my my discussion here from his excellent column on November 13th. So a week out from the election, he tackled this topic, and so he interviewed some restaurant owners and some retailers, especially merchants. So in short order, the three-tier system in the United States for the movement of alcohol is legally enshrined. So unless that piece of paper gets torn up as well, there is the importer, there's the distributor, and then there's the end entity that touches the customer. So either the retailer or the on-premise business. So the rebound pain for Americans and the American wine industry could be significant. If a distributor or retailer, and this applies actually to some extent to control states and control provinces, which most of them are. So if a distributor or retailer loses market share due to European wines saying, let's say, 25% more, they will be raising prices on the rest of their domestic portfolio. So when the CEO, Robert Koch of the California Wine Institute, says this is going to hurt vis-a-vis Canada because it is Canada's our largest customer for wine. And then on top of that, if European wines are costing more, or even the small amount of Canadian wines returning to the US, which we've already covered, it's not that significant, but European wine, yes. So that costs 25% more. There's either going to be less of it sold and or there's going to be a higher price just for it to hit the shelves. So what is that going to do to a mid-size or small or large corporately owned American winery if they are putting their wines through this mandated three-tier system? So it is going to cost more. So one of the New York-based wine merchants that Asimov interviewed on this has done the numbers, and he says for every dollar spent on European wines, American businesses make $4.52 because of this three-tier structure. So in my books, in most sectors I've worked in and spent time thinking about, that's a pretty nice multiplier. That's almost a 5-to-1 multiplier effect. So until it's taken away. And of course, it's many small and family-owned businesses in the wine trade through these various pieces. So this will not be helpful at all for the. So that's one way of answering the impact it will have on the U.S. industry. What kinds of measures will the Europeans take in response? That was the other part of your discussion and question. So this isn't the first time in recent history that some Europeans have faced Trump tariffs on wine. So in 2018 or 19, the Trump administration did levy 25% tariffs on table wines up to, as they defined it, up to 14% alcohol on mostly French, excluded sparkling. And the reason, so the purpose of levying tariffs, this also enters into our thinking about it. That set of tariffs that was levied was in perceived retaliation for Airbus. So we're now talking about aviation, not agriculture, levied against subsidies that were perceived to be against Americans. So Airbus being, of course, a European champion project in the aviation space. So this was intended as a retaliatory measure for European subsidies, and presumably the American government was keener on having Boeing, an American national aircraft champion, to have better access to European procurement. So the retaliatory aspect of that they were very surgical. So I think off the top, we were talking about nuance and all versus nothing. And so the tariffs here, I was just reading about, so the Italians, they did Prosecco in 2019 was left untouched, partly because sparkling was deliberately excluded, partly because Italy doesn't have a role to play, a significant role to play that I know of in the Airbus in framing around it. So this time around, so some of them have some reflexive, maybe muscle memory about how that felt and what they had to do. So French wine producers of table wines under 14% alcohol who did export in small or large proportion to the United States really did have to either trim some prices, as we've already discussed, or think about moving their markets around or face some pain, obviously. This time, the rationale for tariffs seems to be very different. It's really just to build walls around America. So there's certainly going to be fewer carve-outs, and it is going to hurt more across probably all aspects of beverage alcohol production in Europe that exports to the US.
So, wow, a lot there. I think this is why at some points get pulled out of the discussion about this being just about, not just wine, because there's knock-on effects, but also what is the rationale and what is going on behind here. So it's not about wine. This is about other things you've said about, building a fortress perhaps. And how is this different from 2018? Um, and not maybe targeted specific to one industry, or maybe it is. And so this just shows the complexity and the interconnectedness. And, again, I think we could spend a whole episode on the rationale and the historical development of multilateral organizations to support trade liberalization. And the basis of that historically, certainly at least in the 20th century, the EU is the kind of the early stages with the EEC, and that was formed to prevent war from happening again, for people to coexist, for there to be democracy supported, essentially, right? So, those are the origins, right? So we live peacefully, coexist, trade, peacefully together. So I'm going to park that for the moment, but WTO, right?
Right.
So there we go. There is a multilateral organization. Again, I know with your expertise, we could spend an hour on that, and maybe we will one day. But since we're kind of taking this out to altitude, to macro structures, where does the WTO sit in all of this? And that, again, I know is a huge question, but maybe for some context, maybe can you share a little bit in terms of historically, individual nations can bring a complaint to the WTO where there might be, for example, they would say preferential treatment, anti-trade or dumping things. So, certainly other countries have brought actions against Canadian wine industry players at the WTO. So maybe you can give an example of that as a localized, how does that work? But also now going forward,
where do we go?
Is it relevant? What? And I don't mean that in any disrespect, but not to say that it isn't. But I guess the better question is, how might this be relevant in terms of navigating where we're going?
Right. Yeah. So a top line and irresistibly cheeky answer is WTO, WTF.
I was going to say that, but we're obviously thinking the same thing, but I wasn't sure. I'm glad you said it, not me, because you're the expert.
And you can blame it on me if you get pushed.
No, that's okay.
Your lovely audience. So I'm afraid, and I think offline we were chatting about this in preparation. Both of us having international relations backgrounds. The era of rules-based international trade could just be over. Let's be realistic about it. As it is, yes, a country can bring and has brought actions to the World Trade Organization with claims that a given country has committed one of two sins. I've got a couple of principles here. So the basis of the World Trade Organization and the agreement that it governs and administers, which is called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, People have spent their entire careers working on very small, minute sections of this. And it is the invisible, probably overly detailed, but invisible glue that allows most nations who are signatories to trade and trust that their trading partners aren't trying to pull a fast one on them in a few different senses. Now, there's pushback and, bending of rules in all sorts of sectors by many countries that are in good faith signatories to it, but there's always some boundary testing. And so there is a dispute resolution mechanism, which in itself is detailed and takes way too long. So that is one of the chief complaints against it. So the two principles that really matter, why would a country, and this has to only be nation states, it's not, I'm a non-state actor as a consultant and I'm annoyed that someone in a different country is offering consulting services more cheaply than me. Like I'm making it up as I go here, but I don't have any standing, right? It has to be the government of the country. So the first principle is no less favorable treatment. So member countries cannot discriminate among goods or services from their trading partners under these baseline WTO rules through higher pricing or other tariff or non-tariff mechanisms. So, however, some preferential access is permitted through supplemental agreements. So that's where you've got this layering on of what we used to call NAFTA, now the USMCA or CUSMCA. I'm still getting the second version of that acronym wrong. Or the relatively recently concluded Canadian-European Trade Agreement, the CETA.
Right.
But they allow even better treatment for exchanged goods or services than agreed under the WTO. So that's the first principle, is no less favorable treatment. And then the second is equality of opportunity. What does that mean? Imported goods or services should have equal access to the marketplace of a signatory country as those domestically produced. So I have been thinking and writing about this over the past few years, not least because Canada was in the crossfires of a number of countries for perceived preferential treatment of wine retailing and various other aspects of getting wine to marketplace along the supply chain and the sales chain. So I reviewed, actually in preparation for this, I reviewed some of the pieces that I had been thinking about and writing about, and said to myself and anyone who was reading about 5 years ago that these principles, they're not just principles, they're commitments and they're binding, and countries have to live up to them. And there's a dispute mechanism, which there's 60 days and then you don't actually get an answer for a year. So meanwhile, what does a domestically harmed producer do? Yeah. So I think that that's one of the major chinks in the armor. But, in a realpolitik world, which all of us should recognize we are back into in a major way, I have to take back some of my words. Yes, they're principles, and yes, they're commitments. But what if one of your major trading partners, and not even saying just from a Canadian perspective at this point, one of the biggest countries in the world economically chooses to walk away or to ignore or to flaunt or to opt out? And so what are the rest of us going to do? And, you could substitute a couple of different countries' names for that in that definition, right? Yes, we're talking about the United States today, but they're not the only one. And so if the dispute resolution mechanism isn't respected, and, a concrete example of that right now is the appellate body, the dispute resolution panel, cannot be properly constituted because the United States is not sending any representatives. So, and how is that going to change? So I would say, I don't want to say that the WTO has outlived its usefulness, but as a resolution body, and especially as a body that is one of its other roles is to continue to advance or foster the advancement of freer trade among signatories, it's not fit for purpose today.
Yeah. So things are going back to more bilateral, maybe more tripartite.
I would say, well, yeah. I mean, I think we have some good clues from President Trump's first term, And certainly from his actions in all of 3 weeks in his second term, that he has a strong preference for bilateral arrangements. And so how to do multilateral, I mean, this is one of the, things I think that we can also pick up another time if you like, is,
Yeah.
how to respond, right? What are in terms of the
Yeah.
wiring of the international trade system, that sounds a little too big for our
Exactly.
topic, but Canada and Europe, we have a,
Yeah.
a multilateral, because we're talking about 27 or 28 countries there,
Yeah.
agreement. We can do other things, and I think this
Yes.
reading I've been doing is if the United States is removing itself from not just multilateral trade organizations and those international rules based organizations that have provided the international glue for most of the post war, and by that I mean World War II era, if most of that is now in question, what are
Yeah.
the rest of us going to do? And so maybe I leave that as an open question, but I think that these are among the topics that should also be on the table at the meeting in Toronto today among the premiers and prime minister, as well as everyone working on trade and international relations. Canada needs to really pull up its socks really quickly and project a rapid response, so to speak, to really take advantage of some of the other wiring is already there, right? International trade
Yeah.
agreements, say with Europe. We're going to have to act on those. We're going to have to fill those pipelines. We're going to have to manifest concrete action in them. And maybe it's car parts, maybe it's wine,
Mm-hmm.
maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's cheese. We hope.
Well, who knows? Maybe wine will be going on ships up and down between Canada and Mexico. You never know. We don't see much Mexican wine here. Maybe there's an opportunity there. Volumes are small here, but
That's right.
you never know.
Right.
We have bulk, we have
Exactly.
lots. So
So
I think
still
that's a
get
great,
creative.
yeah, and I think that's a great way to round this out, which goes back to some things of points of action that can come from this, not just reaction, but action, and looking within and looking what we can do to build here. You know, America is an been a long-standing ally, friend, neighbor, trade. That isn't going to change the amount of I don't think in broad terms, that kind of what goes across our border. But a lot of people this week are talking about, we can do more within and other markets. This is the time to look at how we can foster other markets. And maybe this is what it means, is that there'll be some, maybe we're looking at our trade relations from, bilateral, multilateral. Maybe there's going to be something hybrid that comes up in between, and we're going to relook at some of these relationships. I mean, this is human history.
Great.
This is
Yeah.
economy. This is fluid, right? And really, this is why one of the things I love about wine, because wine is not just about wine. Wine is about all of these things right now,
Absolutely.
So I want to thank you for this conversation, because to me, it exemplifies what wine can be a springboard in. I mean, I love when you and I just sit down and have a glass of wine, we chat, we don't even talk about any of these issues, but I
Ditto.
love the fact that wine can be a springboard to these issues. I'm sorry that the circumstances in which we're having this conversation, because I believe there will be a lot of pain, and a lot of people, colleagues in our industry, are going to be feeling that. However, I do think we've talked about some silver linings, and where we're maybe going to look for down the road some productivity, innovation, and growth and support that we can build from this. So
Right.
all that to say, before we sign off, Karen, can you let us know where people can find you if they want to contact you and ask you questions, or learn more about your writings? Like, how do we find you?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my website is winedrops.ca. And by email is probably the best. I haven't yet found a social media platform that I'm really happy with these days. So although I am on Instagram, but at Karen Winedrops, but the best way to reach me is email, old-fashioned email, karen@winedrops.ca.
Great. And I'll drop that into the show notes for this episode. And also, Karen, you and I might have a chat about some of the other things we might drop in the show notes. I'm thinking things like what you've referred to, the statements of California Wine Institute, perhaps something by Mr. Asimov, a few other things that have come up during our conversations. I think we'll put that in the show notes as well. So
You bet.
thank you so much. I really appreciate your expertise. I really appreciate your practical outlook. and balancing policy and pragmatism. And I look forward to watching this develop. And I hope that you'll come back on the show and we can pick up the conversation as events unfold. So thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you again sometime soon, I hope.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Tanya. Really enjoyed it. Sad that we have to have a tariff talk in these times, that this is the topic of the day, but thrilled to be with you. And I really hope that some of our exchange is resonant for the audience and maybe gives some food for thought for helping to strengthen good Canadian businesses who are going to need it in the coming months.
Hey, thank you for tuning into my conversation with Karen Graham today. I hope that you found our discussion informative and helpful as you navigate the various currents and emotions swirling around us during this time of looming tariffs. If these kinds of policy and industry matters interest you, I highly recommend that you sign up to receive Karen's blogs and newsletters, which are very informative. You can go to Karen's website to do this, www.winedrops.ca. And please do share this episode with others if you find it will be of interest to them. The more awareness we can bring to trade issues, the more we can be part of building and supporting business and industry, not only relating to wine, but to many other pursuits embraced by Canadians and our neighbors near and far. We look back because history matters, but we can also look forward to unleash our potential. I'm working on my next podcast episode now and look forward to seeing you back here again soon on the TT Wine Explorer podcast. Until then, take care.